Chapter 1. I do not think people will believe my story, but I'm not mad, and I'm not dreaming. Tomorrow, I will die, and I want to make a confession. The events which I'm going to describe here have terrified me, have tortured me, have destroyed me. To me, they seemed horrible and supernatural, but perhaps somebody who is calmer and more rational will find a logical explanation. This is my story. I was a very kind and gentle child who loved animals. As I grew up, this love for animals became greater. This is easy to understand. It is difficult to trust people, but you can always trust a faithful dog. I married when I was young, and my wife liked animals too. We had birds, goldfish, a dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This cat was quite large, beautiful, completely black, and extremely intelligent. In fact, my wife sometimes said that our cat was probably a witch in disguise. She was not really serious about this, and I mention it now only because by chance I remember it. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. He followed me everywhere. Unfortunately, I became a victim of alcohol. I drank more and more. Of course, my personality changed. I became moody and irritable with my wife and pets. At the beginning, though, I respected Pluto and never hurt him. But one night, I returned home very intoxicated. I thought that Pluto was avoiding me. I held him violently, and in his fright the cat bit my hand. I became furious. I was possessed by a demon. I caught the cat again. Then I took a pocket knife from my pocket, opened it, and cut out his eye. I blush, I burn, while I now write these facts. The next day I felt horror for my action, but I continued to drink, and wine made me forget the horrible thing I had done. The cat got better. The empty eye socket was frightening, but the cat was no longer in pain. He went about the house as usual, but obviously he ran away from me in terror. At first, I was sorry about this, but soon it made me angry. And then came the spirit of perverseness. Philosophy does not talk about this spirit, but it is a fundamental part of the human heart. We have all done stupid or terrible things simply because we know that we should not do them. This, then, is perverseness. This spirit of perverseness, I say, destroyed me because one day I decided to kill poor Pluto. With tears in my eyes and sadness in my heart, I put a noose around his neck and hanged him from a tree. I hanged Pluto only because I knew he loved me, only because he had never hurt me, only because I knew that God would never pardon me for the crime. Chapter 2. The night of this crime, there was a fire in my house. My wife, my servant, and I just managed to escape. My entire wealth was destroyed in the fire, and I lost all hope. I do not want to say that there is a connection between my crime and the fire. I only want to record the facts of my story. The day after the fire, I went to visit the ruins of my house. Only one wall remained, and around this wall was a group of people. They were saying things like, strange, singular. I went closer and saw a strange bas-relief on the wall, the figure of a gigantic cat. The image was extremely accurate. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first saw the image of the cat, I was terrified, but I thought about it and found a good explanation. I had hung the cat in the garden next to my house. When the fire began, this garden filled up with people. Somebody probably threw the cat into my bedroom window in order to wake me. The other walls of the house fell in and pressed the body of the cat against this wall. The great heat of the fire and a chemical reaction then made the image. Although I had a logical explanation, that bas-relief made a great impression on my imagination. For months I could not escape the phantasm of the cat. I even tried to find another cat to substitute it. Then, one night in a bar, I saw a black object on top of some hogsheads of rum. I looked closer. It was a large black cat. It was almost identical to Pluto, except it had an indistinct white area on its breast. I caressed the cat, and it immediately got up and purred. It was happy. This was the animal I was looking for. I asked the bartender if I could buy it. He said that it was not his. I continued to caress the cat, and when I left the bar, the cat followed me home. My wife liked this cat very much, but I began to dislike it. I had thought that I would be happier with a new cat. Instead, the affection of the cat only disgusted me. And slowly, this disgust became hatred. I avoided it because I felt some shame for killing Pluto, and I did not want to hurt it too. In addition, this cat, just like Pluto, had only one eye. However, the more I hated this cat, the more it followed me. It is difficult to explain how terrible this was. When I sat down, it would jump on my legs and cover me with horrible caresses. When I got up to walk, it was between my legs, and I would almost fall. This made me so angry that I wanted to kill it, but I was stopped, not by the memory of my first crime, but by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, but I do not know how to define it. I am almost ashamed to admit, as I wait here in my prison cell, that my terror was caused by something incredibly insubstantial. My wife had often talked about the indistinct white patch on the cat's breast, the only difference between him and Pluto. But this indistinct white patch gradually became distinct. I tried to ignore what I saw. I said to myself that it was just my imagination. But this distinct image was the real reason why I did not dare hurt the beast. It was an image that I feared. It was the image of the gallows, that terrible instrument of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. Chapter 3. Oh, how I suffered! You cannot imagine. I had killed a brute beast, and now another brute beast was destroying me. Day or night, I could not rest. During the day, the creature never left me alone, and at night I woke up hourly from terrible dreams with that thing on my face. It was a living nightmare, always there in my heart. All my good thoughts had gone. Evil thoughts filled my brain. I began to hate all things and all mankind. My wife, I am sorry to say, suffered the most. One day, we had to go down into the cellar. The cat went between my legs. I almost fell. I became furious. I grabbed an axe and tried to kill the animal, but my wife blocked my arm. This made me even more furious, and I lifted the axe again and buried it in her brain. She fell dead immediately, without a groan. I had murdered her. Now I had to eliminate the body. There were many possibilities. I could cut the body into little pieces and then burn them, or I could bury it. Finally, I decided to put it inside the wall of the cellar. There was a projection in the wall. I pulled out the bricks with a crowbar. I put the body in there, and then I carefully put back the bricks. Nobody could see the difference. It was perfect. Then I went to look for the cat to kill it too, but the beast had escaped. I did not see it that night. I was finally free of its torment, and that night I slept tranquilly, even if I had just killed my wife. The second and the third day passed. The monster did not return. My happiness was supreme. The police came and searched the house, but of course, they found nothing. I would be happy forever. Then, on the fourth day, the police came again. They told me to come with them while they searched the house. They went down into the cellar again and found nothing. I was so happy that I wanted to say something. I wanted to show that I was really not guilty. "Gentlemen," I finally said, "I am glad that you have no more suspicions. Oh, by the by, isn't this a well-constructed house?" Now, I can't really remember what I said. In fact, I think it's an excellently well-constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen, are really solid. Then, in that moment, I hit the walls with my cane. May God protect me. The noise of my cane was answered by a voice from the tomb. At first, the voice was difficult to hear. It was like a child crying. Then it became louder and louder. One long, loud, and continuous scream, completely inhuman, that came directly from hell. For a moment, the police and I did not move. But then they easily opened the wall. There, inside, was the standing corpse, already greatly decayed and covered with blood. On the corpse's head, with its red mouth open and one eye, was the beast that had made me murder my wife. And now that monster had given me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. The Oval Portrait, Chapter 1. My valet, Pedro, and I were traveling through the Apennine Mountains in Italy. I was badly hurt and had a high fever. We finally saw a very strange and gloomy castle that had been recently abandoned. It was the kind of castle that you can read about in certain old novels about ghosts. Pedro knew that I couldn't remain outside in my condition, so he decided to break into the castle. When he had broken in, he took me to a small room in a turret of the castle. This room had many very old paintings, tapestries, and arms. There were also many spirited modern paintings. I looked closely at them all. They fascinated me greatly, perhaps because I was delirious from the fever. I also found a book that told the story of each of the paintings in the room. Pedro lit the candles of a large candelabrum, and I began to contemplate each piece of art in this bizarre room. I lay in my bed reading and looking at the paintings for a long, long time. Then, Since Pedro was asleep, I moved the candelabrum so I could read more easily. The light of the candles made it easier to read, but it also illuminated a strange little painting in a dark niche. It was the portrait of a lovely adolescent girl. I do not know why, but I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about it. Then I opened my eyes to look at it again. Then I wondered why I was so charmed by this painting. Its frame was oval and gold. The painting itself was done very well. It showed the head and shoulders of the girl. The girl herself was extremely beautiful. The painting had even startled me because for a moment it looked like a living person. Still, none of these three things could explain the secret of its mysterious effect on me. Then I discovered the reason. The expression on her face was almost perfectly lifelike. And this lifelikeness had confused me, startled me, and filled me with horror. I immediately looked in the book for the story of this oval portrait and read the following story. The Story of the Girl in the Portrait, Chapter 2. The girl in the portrait was extremely beautiful and extremely joyous. But it was an evil hour when she married the painter. He was passionate, austere, and studious, and he already had a wife, his art. The girl in the portrait was as happy as a fawn, and she loved and cherished all things. She only hated the art, which was her rival. She was only afraid of the palette, easel, and brushes that took her husband away. It was therefore a terrible thing for her when her husband asked her to pose for a painting. She was very humble and obedient, and she agreed to pose. She posed for this portrait in a cold, unhealthy room of a turret of the castle. The only light in the room came from a small window in the ceiling. The artist worked with energy and only thought of his work. He became obsessed with capturing every shade and color of life on his young wife's face. Since the room where she was sitting was cold and damp, she got more and more ill. Still, her husband did not notice. All he noticed was his painting. He was a wild and moody man, and he was often lost in his own private dream world. Everybody else saw that his wife was getting weaker and weaker. Still, she continued smiling and never complained because she saw that he took such great interest in this painting. He worked day and night to paint the woman who loved him and who was becoming more and more ill for this love. Some of the people who saw him working said, "This painting is truly marvelous. It is proof of both his power as a painter and of his love for his wife." When the painter was finishing the portrait, nobody was allowed in the turret because the painter had become so passionate about his work. He rarely took his eyes from the canvas to look at his wife's face. In fact, he had become so obsessed with his work that he did not notice that as he put red and pink on the canvas, red and pink left his young wife's cheeks. Finally, he only needed to add a little bit of color for the mouth and a little bit of color for the eyes. The living color of his wife's face shone again for a moment, and then went out like a lamp. The painter added the last brush stroke, and for one moment was entranced in front of his painting. He then became pale and began to tremble. He then cried loudly, "This is indeed life itself!" Then he looked suddenly at his wife. She was dead. The Telltale Heart, Chapter 1. True. Nervous. Very, very terribly nervous I was, and I am. But why, will you say, that I am mad? The disease made my senses extremely acute. It did not destroy them. My sense of hearing was very good. I heard all things in heaven and on earth. I also heard things in hell. Why, then, am I mad? Listen how healthily I can tell my story. I cannot say how I first got the idea, but once I had it, this idea never left my brain, day or night. There was no reason for this idea. There was no passion. I loved the old man. He had never done anything wrong to me. I did not want his gold. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of them looked like a vulture's eye, a pale blue eye with a film over it. When this eye looked at me, my blood became cold, and so, gradually, very gradually, I decided to kill the old man and eliminate that eye forever. Well, now you think I am mad. But madmen don't know anything. You should have seen me. I did everything so carefully, so intelligently. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I opened his door, slowly, very, very slowly. I opened just enough for my head. Then I put in a lantern, all closed so that no light came out. And then I put in my head. It was really fantastic how I did this. You would have laughed to see how slowly and intelligently I put my head in his room so that I would not wake him. It took me a whole hour to put my head into his room. Could a madman be so careful? When my head was in his room, I opened the lantern, and its light fell on his vulture eye. I did this same thing for 7 nights, but each night his eye was closed, so I could not do my work. The old man did not bother me. His evil eye bothered me. Chapter 2. Every morning I walked happily into his room. I asked him if he had slept well. I talked to him like a friend, so you can see that he had to be a very wise man to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked at him while he slept. The 8th night, I was more careful than usual when I opened the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than my hand moved. That night, I was stronger and more intelligent than I had ever been. I laughed quietly, and perhaps the old man heard me because he moved. You probably think that I pulled my head back, but no. His room was completely dark, and I knew that he could not see me. I kept pushing my head in. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when the man jumped up and shouted, "Who's there?" I did not move and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and I did not hear him lie down again. He was listening. Then I heard him groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of sadness or pain. Oh no, it comes from a horrible feeling at the bottom of your soul. I knew that feeling well. I had that same feeling every night around midnight when I looked at the old man sleeping. I felt sorry for him, but I had to laugh too. His fear was growing bigger. He tried to convince himself that the noise came from his imagination. He said to himself, "It's just the wind. It's only a mouse running across the floor." Yes, he tried to comfort himself, but he found it all in vain. All in vain, because death's shadow already covered the old man, and it was death's invisible shadow that made him feel the presence of my head in the room. After I had waited for a long time, I decided to open the lantern a little tiny bit. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how carefully, until a single ray of light, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the lantern and onto the vulture eye. His eye was open, wide open, and I became furious as I looked at it. I saw it perfectly, all pale blue, and with the disgusting film over it that made my bones cold. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or body. I had, by instinct, directed the light right on that horrible spot. Now I could hear a low sound, like the sound of a watch enveloped in cotton. I told you before I was not mad, but my senses were very acute. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It made me more furious, just like the beating of a drum that stimulates a soldier's courage. But I did not move. I hardly breathed. I held the light on the eye, and the beating of the heart increased. It became quicker and quicker and louder and louder. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you understand? I told you I am nervous, and I really am. That night, that strange noise made me do something terrible. The beating grew louder, louder. I thought his heart would explode. Then I thought, maybe the neighbors will hear it. It was the old man's moment. With a shout, "Ah!" I opened up the lantern completely and jumped into the room. He screamed once, "Ah!" Once only. In an instant, I pulled him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled happily because I had done so much. But for many minutes, the heart continued to beat under the mattress. This, however, did not bother me. The noise could not be heard through the wall. Finally, it stopped. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the body. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand on his heart and held it there many minutes. There was no more beating. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Chapter 3. If you still think that I am mad, listen how carefully I hid the body. The night was ending, and I worked carefully and quietly. First, I cut off the head, and the arms, and the legs. I then removed some of the boards from the floor and placed the pieces of his body underneath. Then I put back the boards so carefully that no human eye, not even his, could have noticed anything wrong. There was no blood to clean, none at all, because I had been very careful. A tub had caught all the blood. Ha, ha, ha! When I finished my work, it was 4 o'clock, and it was still dark. As the bell of the clock rang 4 times, someone knocked at the door. I went to open it without any fear or worry. I had nothing to be afraid of. 3 men came in. They introduced themselves. They were policemen. A neighbor had heard somebody scream and had thought something terrible had happened, so they called the police. I smiled. What did I have to fear? I told the policemen to come in. I told them that I had screamed because of a bad dream. The old man, I said, was away in the country. I told them to look around, to look everywhere. I took them to his room. I showed them his gold. Then I brought some chairs into the room and put them down over the spot where the body of the victim lay. I told the policemen to sit down and rest a moment. The policemen were satisfied. I had convinced them. They sat, and I talked happily. But in a few moments, I felt myself getting pale, and I wanted them to go. My head ached, and I heard a ringing in my ears, but they continued to talk. The ringing became more distinct. I talked more and more to try to eliminate the feeling. Then I discovered that the noise was not in my ears. I became very pale, and I talked louder and louder, but the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low sound, very much like a watch enveloped in cotton. I could hardly breathe, but the policeman could not hear the sound. I talked more quickly, I talked more loudly, but the noise increased. I stood up and began to argue about stupid things. I shouted. I moved my arms about. Why didn't those policemen leave? I walked around the room quickly, but the noise still increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I screamed. I shouted. I pulled the chair over the place where the noise came from, but the noise was still louder, 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 and still the men talked happily and smiled. Didn't they hear? Oh, God, no, no. They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making fun of my horror. This, I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony, than their making fun of me. I could not bear their hypocritical smiles anymore. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, listen. Louder, 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 louder. Villains! I screamed. Do not pretend anymore. I admit what I did. Pull up the boards. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart.